Hello everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion, which is entitled Reporting Economics Just Got Harder. My name is John Crowley, and I am the editor-in-chief of the International Business Times. Prior to that, I was the digital editor at the Wall Street Journal in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So economics is famously and somewhat erroneously referred to as the dismal science, but it's safe to say that false news is lending a whole new meaning to the phrase bad economics, with everyone from the Twitter troll to populist politicians misappropriating numbers and stats to their own ends. What can journalists, pollsters, and financial institutions do to ensure that the business of numbers is reported in a balanced and objective way? How do we skill up newsrooms, stay clear of jargon, and reach out to audiences without making them feel patronized or excluded? So last year, during the EU referendum, the then Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, said people had had enough of experts. Well, the depth of knowledge and expertise on this panel is likely to give Michael Gove the shakes. So the format of this discussion will go as this. Each panelist will introduce themselves, give a little bio, and then address one of my questions. We'll then open it up amongst ourselves, and then I will throw it open to the floor. And then right at the end, I think we've all agreed that each panelist will come up with one actionable solution. Let's see if they can do that. So without further ado, let me introduce to my immediate left is Diana Henriques, who is an award-winning journalist and writer. And perhaps, Diana, if you can tell us, your experience over the last few decades, seeing how the business of economics have changed, and bearing in mind the events of the last 12 months, how you see it developing in the future.
Am I audible now? Yes. I've had a long career in journalism, going on to 4 decades now, it can be admitted. And the changes in the world of business and finance coverage in the media has been extraordinary, really just extraordinary. In the very early days of my journalism career, you would be hard-pressed to find business and economics news prominently portrayed in even the largest American newspapers. John's former employer, the Wall Street Journal, was exceptional in focusing exclusively on that, and people assumed if anybody wanted any of that dull, dry, useless information, they'd subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and be done with it. But the economic disruptions of the 1970s changed that. The twin Arab boycotts that greatly reduced the supply of petroleum to the U.S., a long period of what was called stagflation, high rates of inflation, low rates of economic activity that kind of bollocks the traditional economic cure for either one of those, one being high rates, which would hurt the other, and the other being low rates, which would feed inflation, alerted even New York City taxi drivers to the importance of economic news. And so economic news, as in the nuts and bolts of the economy, price levels, imports, that sort of thing, began to move onto the front pages and into more prominent roles. Financial news, not so. It still lagged behind until in the 80s we saw this outbreak of takeover activity, the financialization of virtually every known asset, the rise of Wall Street in the late 1980s, and the dominance of that financial sector. That again challenged the media to climb another new learning curve to figure out how finance worked. What exactly was a swap? What was an interest rate futures? To figure out these gimmicks of financial engineering that were so changing the flow of capital. So we climbed that learning curve, and then what do we meet? We meet the digital revolution, where we have to learn a whole new vocabulary of technology and how technology is reshaping the economy. So Add to that, just one last point, is a remarkable fragmentation of economic activity. I'm just finishing a book on the 1987 market crash. In the beginning of the 1980s, the New York Stock Exchange handled 90% of the daily stock trading activity in the United States. Today, it handles roughly 20%. And the rest of the stock trading activity occurs in any of 62 different platforms, some of them visible to regulators, some of them not. So the fragmentation of economic activity across the economy and the increasing complexity of it, I think, has been an enormous growth challenge to business journalists, and we've got a lot of learning yet to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
An abrupt stop. So let me introduce to my immediate right Lucy Marcus, who is responsible for bringing this august panel together. And the first... I take the credit, not the blame. The first multi-tiered question that I have for Lucy is, have economists, financial institutions, and journalists, are we guilty as charged as being, talking down to the general public? If so, how can we fix that? And bearing in mind those first two questions, if we're kind of beating ourselves up too much, are we obscuring what perhaps we're doing well?
Technology, so confusing. I think there are a couple of things to it. As you pointed out, we're living in a time when expertise is not so valued. And in some ways, it's our fault. We've lost the trust of people, like everybody else. I mean, trust is at such a low. We've used our own special language to almost keep ourselves apart and special. Either it's because we're ivory towered, or it makes us feel, sort of more powerful because, we call something different that actually has a normal name. We don't want to use that name. And so, or things have gone wrong even when an expert has said it would go this way. Experts have expertise, but they don't have, what are those things called? Yeah, well, clairvoyance, but what's the ball? The crystal ball. I lose small words. And so it's, by holding ourselves out as experts, and then when we disappoint, that is problematic. And in the meantime, and Ben will talk more about this, we say that something is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen, then the fault is ours, which is not completely wrong. I mean, I think there are also a lot of people who peddle themselves as experts who actually are just chancers. So there's that. And I think there are a couple things that are different in the time we're living in now that there were in the past as well. First of all, you didn't hear from the expert to the regular community of people. It often was filtered through a journalist. But now, I mean, I write a monthly column for something called Project Syndicate, and all it is people who are experts. So, so besides me, Nouriel Rubini and Joe Stiglitz and, a whole cast of people write monthly, and that's, instead of getting just a quote in a newspaper about something that somebody else decides is important, or getting a tome of an academic document that describes something, I will work almost harder in the 800 words to write something down, get it across in a concise manner, and using language people will understand. And then that's taken and translated into, I think, 13 languages and distributed around the world to newspapers in developing and also and developed but also underdeveloped countries, which I think is extremely important. So places where I wouldn't necessarily write specifically for the paper in Kinshasa will still get the document that I write, and that's a very important way of democratizing information and ensuring that nobody is bereft of the knowledge that they need directly. So I think that's one thing that works really well. The other thing is we mustn't underestimate the power of the people. So we talk about how people are, the populism and how cross people are, but actually one of the things I've written a lot about is how people power is successful in my area. I work on business and ethics, corporate governance and boards, things like that. So much has changed so quickly, and a lot of it is thanks to social media and so on. So, the things that cause us problem also can be a part of the solution. I write about FIFA and, terrible corporate governance of that, or nonprofits and what's going on in that world. But always the theme is, business and ethics and governance and so on, and, which you can apply because everything, we were talking about this at breakfast this morning. If you're on Twitter, you saw the picture of us talking intently. And we were preparing hard for you. And there is no area now that isn't a business. Football, a business. Music and the arts, a business. Every organization, fashion, I've written a bunch about fashion, every organization, every sector, all of you at some point in your lives have or will sit on a board, will be responsible for the distribution of money, if it's a nonprofit board, a for-profit board, parent-teacher board, it's all the same stuff, and that comes with a lot of responsibility. And that also means that if you're doing something wrong, and we need more transparency, I talk a lot about transparency and building trust and so on, if something's going wrong, people will know and they will see and they will ask you to be accountable. So as journalists who cover this, I write opinion, which is a lovely luxury, but one of the things that we've talked about is we need journalists who are covering this area to really understand it and take the time to go deep on understanding how businesses work and how to push people and ask hard questions, which you really need to do, and how to get different voices and so on. So I think that answers all the questions.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, now we move on to Ben Page, who is the Chief Executive of market research organisation Ipsos Mori. And it's pretty fair to say, Ben, I think that pollsters have taken a bit of a kicking over the last 12 months. We were talking earlier about the perils of perception, and perhaps, people have got a certain idea in their heads that have been formed. What would you say to that?
Opinion polls have margins of error, and generally, we look at Brexit and Trump as two failures of opinion polling, where the polls were 3-4% out, although not on Hillary Clinton's share of the vote, which they obviously accurately predicted that she would beat Donald Trump roundly in the popular vote. But just remember that there are lots of other elections going on all over the world all the time, and if you look at the polls in those, this classic human thing about looking for patterns, and because Brexit and Trump were disruptive and the polls were not as good as they have been in other events, the idea becomes that we run the argument that all polls are rubbish, when actually if you look around the world at the Netherlands recently, Ireland last year, South Africa, Poland, I can cite loads of places where the polls were fine. So, but there are challenges. What's the exam question?
Well, are other people, is it confirming people's world? So they want to think that something's wrong, they want to...
Well, I think the perils of perception is people have... I don't think there's any sign that people are more deluded than they may have been in the past. But what we've been doing over the last few years is looking at how wrong the public are about lots of things. So in Britain, the public believe that a quarter of the population are Muslims. I can't remember the figures for Italy, I'm sorry. But we know that, for example, in Britain, people believe that a quarter of the entire welfare budget that's spent on pensions and benefits is fraudulently claimed. The actual figure is 0.7%. And this is because of media reporting of factual remarks that have been framed in a particular way by politicians. So similarly with business, people, the bottom line is people don't understand numbers, and neither do politicians. And I suspect journalists may not either. So if you ask the public to predict how often you will get the same answer if you flip a coin twice, heads or tails, the public is massively wrong on that. The politicians are massively wrong. And I think understanding probabilities in this complex world that we live in, understanding numbers, is hugely important. And all the evidence is that in most Western democracies, we value literacy and writing well more than we value numeracy. And certainly that's what people, when we ask people about their children, all across Europe. They said they were eloquent and good at writing than they were being good at maths.
Very good points. I think that we'll return to that shortly when we open the panel discussion. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Michael Steen, who is Head of Media Relations at the European Central Bank. Michael formerly worked as the Frankfurt Bureau Chief for the FT and for Reuters as well, a long storied career there. Have you got a presentation that you want to show? Do you want to? All right, you're going to do some. We're going to do, all right, we're moving swiftly on. You will make some remarks. So I guess what I've seen you've been doing at the ECB is kind of demystifying kind of economics for the wider public out there, and having, covered the ECB myself prior to your joining the ECB, sometimes it was hard to kind of understand what was coming out of the institution. Tell us about those explainers that you've been doing on YouTube and elsewhere.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, John. I should say first of all that I'm very much a non-expert working in an expert organisation. I wouldn't want to claim to be more expert than I am, but I think that's valuable and important, exactly for the points that others have raised. This problem of special language and that being a block. I mean. Yes, and the other thing Lucy's reminding me that I should also say that anything I say here is my personal opinion. Although I work as a spokesperson, I'm not today speaking officially for the central bank. That out of the way, I can carry on. But one of the things that we definitely noticed, and I think this came out in the financial crisis, was that suddenly the policies of the central bank become incredibly important. They become front page news. Journalists that don't normally write about it write about what we're doing in monetary policy and other areas, and it becomes very controversial and very heated very quickly. So one of the things that we've tried to do to address that is that we launched in mid-2015 an explainers section on our website, and if you go to the homepage of the ECB, I didn't have a presentation, I had a couple of slides, but basically just to show you that if you go to the homepage of the ECB and you look along the top, the third word along is explainers. And if you click on that, that's our sort of repository for our attempts to explain in very simple language and in all languages of the EU, very basic stuff like what is a central bank? How many people actually learnt at school what a central bank is? I mean, I think that's a hugely overlooked area. And the problem is the word bank has become a bit of a block since the crisis. Also, what is money and how does money work? And then you can lead on to monetary policy and so on. So that's kind of our sort of one of our attempts to have a positive answer to some of these huge challenges. Of course, that relies on people going to the website. I'd say we've had some limited success in this. We've had, in 2016, 500,000 hits on these explainers, which is not at all bad. However, there's 35 million citizens in the euro area, so we've clearly got lots of room to grow as well there. And we try and push, when we push a lot of stuff out on our Twitter account to try and draw people in. We don't currently do Facebook, which is one of those debates. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important to as an institution, to be seen to be stepping out of the ivory tower to help people generally understand, and also to help journalists. And the other plug I'd like to make, without getting too plug-tastic about this, is that we run, and this predates my arrival 3 years ago at the ECB, so we run regular journalist seminars, which we're really happy for people to apply to come to. The next one is on the 5th and 6th of July, and we publish the details a month or two ahead of time on our website. We're usually oversubscribed, but we do track who applies and try and, over time, satisfy as much demand as possible. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's the yeah, what else do I want to say? No, explainers and seminars are the big contributions. I think one other, just as a former journalist, one other comment I would make at the outset is, of course, the joke is a bit, as a journalist, your job is to simplify and exaggerate. That becomes very difficult in my world, and that's where really clear and simple explanations of what you're doing and why are incredibly important. Because I think there has, maybe people have always said this, but it feels like there's been a coarsening of the public debate. I mean, just this week, the Die Zeit, which is a very well-respected German quality weekly newspaper, had an opinion piece in it which actually called the ECB Satan's Bank, because the writer was unhappy about low interest rates, which means a low nominal return on savings. I mean, I think if you enter into that sort of territory, things get emotional very quickly, and that's very difficult as an institution that deals in facts and figures and data to know how to address properly. And I think that very much the first step is trying to be clear in your explanations of what you're doing and why.
Some fascinating topics that have come up there. Did you want to come in there on a point, Diana?
I did. Yes, I did, because I think that reliance on facts and figures raises a current problem that I perhaps should have raised more recently. The quality of the economic data that we're going to be getting going forward is going to be problematic. Reliable institutions like like Michael's and like the Federal Reserve in the U.S. are probably going to be okay. They're probably going to be able to maintain the data collection quality and analysis that they have been doing, I think. President Trump will have several appointees to fill on the Federal Reserve Board. Yet to be seen what will happen there. But the government task of gathering statistics, gathering data, jobs data, tax data, import and export data, that sort of thing, is all reliant on how good a data gathering operation you have, and it costs money. And when you look at the budgets that are being printed, now Trump's recent budget, forget it. I mean, it's a PR release. It's not an actual budget. But there will be an actual budget that will go through the Congress. And I, for one, will be looking extensively at what is happening both to the statistical support efforts in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in the NOAA, the atmospheric weather conditions, extremely important to the economy in many ways, and what happens to the financing for fiscal regulation, the watchdogs in the environment. Going forward, these are going to be the challenges. We're going to have fewer sources of well-documented data. We're going to have to get smarter about figuring out what's garbage and what's not. And we're going to have to watch to be sure that the watchdog infrastructure for the financial markets doesn't collapse and fall apart on itself.
Yeah, following on that, I mean, I think one of the things that it's our responsibility as people who write about finance or the economy or anything about business is to be fact-based. And so I write opinion, and that's perfectly fine. But the one thing that we can do that we couldn't do before, and you can't really do in print, is I put as many hyperlinks as I can so that if there's something you don't understand or there's something that you find interesting and want to know more about, as much as possible I go to primary sources. So I link to the report I'm referring to, or I link to the original article or the transcript of a talk or a video, whatever it is. I mean, I do all kinds of things. And my pieces sometimes look quite link heavy, but I'd rather have that so that if you're reading it, you think, oh, that's interesting, but I don't know what that is. You can go deep and do, self-learning, and that also helps with this jargon issue and helps with educating people about finance. So even with opinion, calling it Satan's Bank, if I can't link to something that proves that Satan is in some way associated, I'm reluctant to. Is there?
Obviously, you wouldn't be allowed to have an account there anyway because it's a central bank, so it would have to be a bank of Satan that was, which is an important distinction.
Satan's
I think.
Bank's bank.
You've heard it here first. The Bank of Satan. There were some points that Ben made on kind of. We've been talking about media literacy. What about educational literacy there? What would you have to say further on that?
I don't think it's true that people are becoming less numerate. I'm not sure of the evidence on that. I think lots of people would show that people in lots of countries are actually passing more exams than ever. But certainly, I think in some industries, and possibly journalism in one, my own industry, where there's pressure on costs and people are become reliant on other data sources. So my industry is subject to de-skilling. It's not the reason for the accuracy or otherwise of political opinion polls, which in my industry are only 0.01% of what we do in any case. Most of what we do is for big global companies or governments, and it's never published. But certainly in the 30 years I've been involved, the stuff that I used to be able to do on a calculator in the 1980s, the young graduates nowadays, they can't do it. They rely, the computer tells them the answer. And increasingly they're relying on algorithms or calculations done by other people, which they just assume are right. And indeed, the use of the internet for gathering data as well is also, again, leading people not to have to create things from scratch, which in one way is good because it's faster, but it does mean that they're, garbage in, garbage out. So I think there are some real challenges, and certainly, the decline of local media, of course, because of budgets, again, means you've got, again, de-skilling, I think, in your profession, quite frankly.
Michael, have you got any thoughts on education?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the numeracy point that Ben made earlier is obviously incredibly important, and I'm a parent. As a parent, I think it's important that children learn to think critically, and I think there's other panels on that today as well. In terms of how you can improve these things, I think that the role for the media here is to be incredibly critical always of everyone, and I would include. I know. So from my current point of view, I'm perfectly happy for very critical articles. What we try and do is agree on a factual basis before that. And as a Brit, what sort of upset me, I think, about the whole Brexit process was that there were a lot of blatantly wrong numbers flying around. And I think you need two things for a successful campaigner: a story, a narrative, take back control, and a number, in this case £350 million a week on the side of the bus that you're going to get back for the NHS or whatever. And that there wasn't a more vicious attack on that kind of free and easy, hey, here's a number, you want numbers, here you go, this is what we're going to get, was disappointing.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things that is very important is that people who cover these areas know what they're talking about. And it's constantly changing. It's just like science. I mean, what's happening is constantly changing, and you have to constantly skill up in order to get good at it. I've spent a goodly amount of time, actually, going into newsrooms and talking to editors and also beat reporters in various areas to explain about how business works, and also to say, look, it's your responsibility to hold board members to account and to hold chief executives to account. And it sounds counterintuitive, somebody who sits on boards, but actually it raises all boats. So if there's transparency, and if journalists are asking the hard questions, and consumers are more educated, then everything works better. And it is, I believe, really important to remind board members that they're not just there to fly in, have a slap up lunch and fly out again, but actually to be held to account. And one of the things that's interesting is, journalists, for some reason, they are not willing to accept the I can't talk about that from politicians who have been elected, but they are willing for a board member to say, I'm sorry, I can't speak about that, and just be, okay, I'll walk away. And actually, there are some things we can speak about, and we should be held to account for how we voted on pay, and how we voted on, environment, and, held responsible for that. And I think that's a powerful and important thing that journalists need to push harder on.
I think the point about Brexit, which obviously is live in my mind as a Brit and as an opinion pollster, is that, and it ties in with Trump, and it's obviously something that people will be discussing elsewhere in this conference, and that is that it's clear that if you listen to the Vote Leave campaigners, they knew the £350 million a week to the NHS claim was false. They knew that the claim that Turkey would be fast-tracked to EU membership and 75 million Turkish people would be free to travel to Britain was also fake. But I think, and fake news has always been around, But as what they're using is Ronald Reagan's maxim: if you're explaining, you're losing. And it's what the liberals do, and is then go off and start arguing about the number. But meanwhile, of course, what the politician has done, either the Brexit politician or Trump, has drawn attention or used an argument or a fake fact that absolutely aligns with the views of the constituency that they want to appeal to. They aren't going to worry about the other side or journalists arguing about the facts. And they're, of course, distracted while the protagonist then moves on. So I think the arrival of social media, which is really only a decade old, means that all of this stuff moves more rapidly, and we are in a very tricky place because my solution, of course, is organisations like Full Fact, independent organisations that will call out on both sides. But the bottom line is nobody is going to, a lot of people aren't going to want to pay attention to that because we've known long before the internet started that people choose the sources of information that confirm their prejudices. So I think there are some real challenges in the environment that we're in now, particularly with this turn of events we've had over where campaigners of all sorts have realised that lying is fine.
Just one further addendum to that. One of the things that really gets spread quickly on social media, of course, is kind of fake polls as well, and memes and stuff like that. There's a 2,000-word article that may be fake news. That will get shared, but like that old adage, a picture telling 1,000 words. If you have something that confirms your prejudices, then it spreads even further. Diana?
I'm trying to drift towards the part where we keep you from being totally depressed. Not that there's not good reason to be, but I would like to hope that the very tools that have made this sort of fact-free campaigning so easy can make the counterclaims, the accurate claims, easier to spread as well. But an appeal, please, to the journalists who have immediate and direct access. I don't think this is a problem. This lack of economic and financial sophistication. I don't think that's a problem that print journalism can really help a lot in the first instance. I think this has to come from the radio and the television commentary because that's more immediate. It's certainly more it's used, relied on more heavily, and alas, it is our least numerate and least financially literate segment of media. So I'm begging you, please, learn some basic financial fluency and economic fluency in the rapid response media that can address some of these myths and dangerous misrepresentations, because I think that will enable us to harness the same tools that are being weaponized against the truth and harness them in the service of accuracy. And one last point in terms of what we do is in the media and everyone's sitting here giving us tasks. You noticed that, didn't you? And the media has to do this and the media needs to do that. Well, as the media representative here, I think one of the things that we need to do is to communicate more clearly among ourselves about what skill sets we really need to have. If you want to be a journalist for the next 10 years, you better learn. You better learn finance. You better learn how corporations work. You better know that kind of governance, because there's just not going to be a role for journalism otherwise if you're not educated in that field.
Well, one thing that Diana said this morning was that there are more jobs, that the one place that actually is growing in the fields of journalism is financial journalism.
Yes, that is where the jobs are.
So that's where the jobs are. So, but in order to do it well, you need to be skilled up. And so one of the things we were talking about, I was talking about with Christopher, who runs the conferences, maybe next year doing a workshop on financial journalism. So if that's something that you think would be interesting, you have to let me know, because otherwise we can eat gelato. So, but I do think that there are certain skills and abilities and pathways and encouragement to help people who want to transition into that.
But this is coming at a time when the race to the bottom to kind of get clicks and kind of falling resources. We've talked about educational literacy. We've touched on newsroom literacy as well a little bit. Is that an issue that needs to address, and how do you address it when it's kind of all about money?
Well, you can spend the same money to hire a reporter who knows how to look at a balance sheet and income statement as you can to hire a reporter who doesn't, frankly. And that's the unfortunate thing. There's been a tolerance in newsrooms my entire career for ignorance about business that would never be tolerated in any other sector. No, yes, if I were to present myself to the New York Times as a whiz-bang financial writer who knew all about balance sheets and accounting principles and so forth, but I didn't know actually the difference between baseball and soccer, the editor would laugh me out of his office. And it will be a him, most likely. He would laugh me out of his office. And the fact that I'm not interested in it, that I don't play it, that I don't have any skill at baseball or at soccer, would not exempt me from condemnation. So the fact that you're not good at numbers, the fact that you don't like numbers, the fact that you don't follow the stock market should not exempt you from needing to have a knowledge about it. And yet, if you showed up in that same editor's office, unable to say the difference between a stock and a bond, unable to identify the current interest rate in the marketplace, it wouldn't bother him in the least. If you were going to be a sports writer and you knew the difference between baseball and soccer, you'd get the job even if you didn't know the difference between a stock and a bond. If you're going to be a finance writer and you don't know the difference between baseball and soccer, you're not going to get the job. So I think it has to be institutionally changed. We have to end this long tolerance for financial ignorance in the newsrooms. It ought to be a disqualifying lapse if you can't master some basics about finance and markets.
Well, Diana, talking of going from one expertise to another.
Oh, no.
Okay, so you are the author of the book The Wizard of Lies.
That's true.
Based on your interviews with Bernie Madoff and
yes.
the Ponzi scheme in the fall. And there is a movie being released next month based on your book, in which you star in playing yourself. What was it like auditioning to play yourself?
I did actually have to pass a screen test to play myself, which is a surreal experience.
Do you think...
Oh, well, I'll give the full advertisement here. HBO has adapted my book, The Wizard of Lies, which is available on Amazon, for a television film starring Robert De Niro as Bernie Madoff. And
is he known as Bob to you?
He asked me to call him Bob. What can I tell you? You can't keep calling him Mr. De Niro on the set, you know. But they recreate my interviews with Bernie Madoff in the film, which was quite fun. It was a remarkable experience as a financial journalist to get behind the scenes and see all of the different forms of artistry that are involved in making a movie. But it also will, I urge you, if you can see it, to see it, or to read the book if you can, because understanding how con artists work, understanding the skills that make con artists successful is I think, something that every political reporter these days really needs to master.
But and actually, I'm proud to be able to say I knew her before that time. And maybe next time she will just cut me dead.
This is
with
when
her
I
glasses.
whip on my black
Exactly.
glasses, right?
But one thing that I think is interesting about that is, you know, part of our responsibility is to make these stories interesting. You know, you have to meet people where they are. And if you write a dry story, no one's going to read it. But actually, you know, to think that fundamentally a complex financial story could be made into a movie, which sort of sneakily educates people, is not unimpressive. And it's our responsibility. I mean, when I write my pieces, I try to tell a story and to have a theme to it and to make it accessible, because it's not in my interest or anybody else's interest to use special jargon and to make it inaccessible. And I think you have to understand the topic well enough to make it easy to understand. Because, of course, if you don't understand it that well, then you can't actually simplify it.
One of the things about fake news is that it plays on emotions. That's why it does so well on Facebook. And the problem with the truth is sometimes it's not always that sexy and harder to sell. And with that in mind, you know, we kind of semi-beating ourselves up a little bit about, you know, what perhaps we've done wrong and how we can rebuild trust. But what about the great and washed out there, people who don't care? So, you know, truth can be subjective as well as objective. I mean, how do we, get through to them when they don't really want to know the economic facts? Or is that another patronizing assertion from ourselves?
Well, in one way, here is another little bright silver lining, to the extent that it is one. Reality bites eventually, and in the economy more than anywhere else, your readers and your viewers will soon know whether you got it right or not. And all the political rhetoric in the world can't produce jobs in West Virginia, and eventually people there will notice that those jobs didn't show up. So when we're talking about the political battles on the culture front, it's impossible to prove whether same-sex marriage erodes the matrimonial bonds and changes society or whatever, but you can tell whether the economy is growing or not. So covering economic and financial news does have a rubber meets the road moment where reality steps in and shapes perception. And our job is to make sure, A, that we see it, and B, that we accurately convey it when it happens.
Michael, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I totally agree on that. But eventually the truth does tend to out, doesn't it? But in terms of how, I didn't want to sound like I was beating up journalists earlier. And I beat myself, and believe me, I beat myself up as, on this as well. I mean, one of the challenges that we find a lot is matching the speed, because these days everyone is now, deadlines are kind of, The Economist now writes in real time, Bloomberg writes big think pieces. So one of the challenges I face sort of more or less on a daily basis is matching the speed of the outside world to the speed of the inside world. And if we preempt as much as possible, but if we see something we strongly suspect is wrong, the first question is this right? Is it, is this factually accurate or not? Which then requires depending on the subject, but more often than not, there's these very sort of arcane things, and you have to go digging, and that takes time. So from an institutional point of view, the challenge to provide good information in a timely fashion to the media is there, and I think one that we all have to live up to. And the other thing I just wanted to mention on I spoke earlier a bit about these explainers that we're doing, and we started off doing them in text, and we've now graduated to doing a few more videos. And we tried actually in January to do our first kind of slightly more emotional one, because it was a nice simple idea that was actually one of our trainees came up with, which was that there's now been a generation of children that have grown up with the euro and didn't have national currencies. So we just sat down a bunch of kids with old currency from before the euro, from across Europe, and let them play with it, and they just talked. And we made like a 3-minute video and put it out on YouTube and tweeted it out and so on. And it was really nice, and that spoke. That was, I thought, a good example of being able to. It's not meant to be propaganda, but it's just meant to remind you, one, this thing's actually been around for a while. You may think it's a failure because that comes up a lot, but actually it's not. And look, these kids all don't know anything else. This is now life as it's lived.
The only other piece I would add is one of the reasons it's so important that as journalists or opinion writers or pollsters or anybody else who's covering the numbers is if we get it wrong, it changes markets. And so it's a special responsibility. If you are a celebrity reporter and you write something mean about, a rock star, it hurts their feelings, but it doesn't necessarily ruin everything. But you can watch the markets when comments are made that are wrong, and they just, or they go up, or whatever. And I think that's why it's so important, in a way, to have that extra responsibility of following the numbers, understanding the numbers, reporting them accurately.
Okay. I don't want to open ourselves up to the accusation that we are being remote and elite. So now I'm going to open, even if we are, yes. I'm now going to open it up to the floor. So if anyone has any thoughts or questions, stick your hand up and we'll try and get a mic to you. Just...
Stand up, he says. Hello, my name is Rachel Jolly. I'm the editor of Index and Censorship magazine. I'm interested to know if you think economics writers, financial writers, should spend more time outside financial centres, so outside London or outside Frankfurt, maybe looking at the economics of, a small town and what it's like to work there, and getting out of the bubble more.
Yes, I really do, and not just, again, when I said before that everything is business, it's not just the economic reporters and the financial reporters, but people who are in various industries should have a better understanding of business and how that relates and how that affects the story. So, if there's somebody who's covering the central bank, they don't necessarily have to be the one to go into the small town in Germany, but the person who it's their job to go into the small town in Germany, they need to go and get a sense of how what happens there goes somewhere else. But I also don't think it hurts it for the people who are covering big business to understand how it affects the people.
Is that one for pollsters to address as well?
Well, I mean, we're out knocking in my country, so I'm only responsible for Britain and Ireland, but we have 1,000 people knocking on doors all over the United Kingdom. So we are certainly out there, and we're interviewing people all over the country. I guess there's an interesting issue that, like journalists, pollsters tend to be sitting in major cities and reflect the population of metropolitan centres. What Brexit and Trump show, and they don't have a lot in common, but they do have two things in common. They are the revenge of small towns and rural areas, and not against metropolitan centres, and people, of course, who don't have a degree or a higher education. There's a very strong correlation with both the voters on both sides of the Atlantic. So you could argue that there's a polarisation going on and the elite is in a bubble, and so probably getting out to imagine life outside your cosy bubble is probably a good thing for the soul. And even though we sit there and look at the data on computers, or we listen to videos, or we have all of this stuff, there's nothing like experiencing it firsthand. And I think that's certainly been a lesson for me over the last 18 months.
Michael, Mario Draghi goes out regularly, doesn't he, when they do the ECB press conference, to outside Frankfurt as well. What else does the ECB do, kind of outside that? Is there any light you can shed?
I think it's a great question, first of all, and we do the press conference rotates every. So we used to be twice a year, but we've reduced the number of meetings, so it's once a year now externally. We do school visits and university visits, and we've been trying. And I think we don't necessarily at the ECB do this enough, but I think the Bank of England actually does quite a good job of this, of sort of getting out and actually for the decision makers to see some of the real economy. And for the journalists, I think it's the best economic journalism can be written from the factory shop floor, where you ideally understand both. And I would also say it's a two-way street. And I think there's a nice example here at the conference. I shared the bus ride with him the other day, but there's a Dutch writer called Joris Leundijk who approached banking as an anthropologist, and he did a series of blogs for The Guardian on it, and then wrote a very successful book. So absolutely, I mean, that's part of getting out of the ivory tower is getting out of the ivory tower. One more plug is we're also we have a. We're opening a visitor centre, hopefully this year, to try and get people into the central bank and be able to talk to them. And we also have a load of visitors. I mean, I've forgotten the number, but I think last year, so even before we had the visitor centre, we had, I can't remember the number, we had tens of thousands of people anyway so far coming into our new building in Frankfurt. And we have a public inquiries team that last year dealt with 11,000 public inquiries. So it is this ivory tower problem is something that absolutely has to be broken down from every angle.
Diana, getting out from Wall Street onto Main Street?
Well, Wall Street is an increasingly fragmented place and very difficult to visit. You can go and take a photo of yourself in the front of the Raging Bull downtown, but that doesn't really... And now the little girl, that doesn't really get you very close to where Wall Street is happening. Stocks trade in server farms out in the suburbs. The computers trading with other computers driven by algorithms designed in the academy. So it's not the world of the stock exchange, but I do endorse very much the idea of when we're talking about this where the rubber meets the road concept. It's in the towns where the factories are located. It's in the malls where the shops are being shuttered. I mean, that's what I was talking about when the reality bites. You can see the economy. You can see it. And getting out to where it's visible at the edges to see on the margin how well it's performing is an essential task. I just want to again say your experiment with video being so powerful underscores my earlier message about how important it is for the journalistic stewards of audio and video to up the game, to raise your expertise and to raise your degree of mastery of these economic and financial issues, because you're really the people who have to get outside the cities and reach the people who are getting most of their news from those channels.
Next question. There's a lady just here.
Thank you. Hi. Is that on? No. Yeah, it is. Okay. Hi, great chat. I edit a Canadian foreign policy. It's a digital magazine. And it's kind of piggybacking on the last question, because we deal with a lot of stories that, climate change, for instance, in Canada especially, it's about, all over the world, the story of getting away from fossil fuels. It's a number story. Trade, now we're looking at NAFTA, and I can't find many freelancers who want to, go and just read up on that and be really passionate about it.
I've met some here.
Okay, yeah. Chat with me after. But I guess, just following that, because I hear from all of you, we need to be more to up our game on our financial literacy. So, are there any other initiatives? Yours sound great, or sites or things that you would recommend for freelancers to, how do we kind of go from A to B to, other than just saying, read and try and learn.
Yeah, I can give a plug here for an organization on whose board I served for 16 years. It's the Society of American Business Editors and Writers. Its acronym is SABEW, SABEW.org. And on the sabew.org site, you will find a wealth of tutorials on basic business skill sets that you need. You will find links to other websites that provide tutorials. Oddly enough, the Securities and Exchange Commission at sec.gov in the US has some wonderful and simple and accessible explainers on the operations of marketplaces. So on the web, there are resources for journalists to self-educate, and you can do that a lot faster than you can go get an MBA from Harvard. So by all means, check out some of these resources to educate yourself with.
The other thing is some of the business schools do courses, free courses for journalists to learn some of the fundamentals of business. There's a directorship one and so on. And they do it for free, because then you go in and you meet all of the professors that they hope you one day will quote, which is fine, because it gets you in there and gets you learning the things that you need in a 2 or 3 day course, or at least to start.
One other question down here at the front.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Mary Hockaday from the BBC. So, Diane, I completely agree about the importance of the literacy being part of the immediate news and reaction. And certainly the BBC, we have both specialist teams, and every now and then we try and kind of sheep dip the general newsroom in some of this. Not always easy, but the responsibility is well understood. I wanted to ask you all a question, really, which is in the heat of the last year, and especially all the conversations about fake news, and nobody trusts anything, nobody believes anything, nobody even wants to believe anything, they just want to vote on their opinion and so on. I have felt that somehow the world of business and business news is the saving grace, because surely business people want the truth, because they have to make business decisions and investment decisions, and so the need, in other words, the flame will continue to burn in this space, even if the rest of us have given up. But I guess what I want to ask all of you is that really right? Is your sense that the world of business really does operate and want to operate on the truth? Or is this world of prejudice and perception and thought bubbles, it's one of the big discussions after the crash, isn't it? The group thing. So do you think that's changed? And I'm being a bit flip about this, but the notion that somehow the space of and need of truth in the world of business will save us all.
Well, it's back to your point. I think we were discussing this earlier today, and I think actually, as we've already seen, some of the cures for fake news, or the internet allows fake news to circulate more rapidly, but it also provides chances for rebuttal. But actually, when it came to business, I think our view, but my colleagues on the panel will agree or disagree, ultimately, capitalism means that business needs the truth, numbers about interest rates, whatever, to be right in order to operate. And if governments interfere with those data, we've seen this in Argentina in the past, other means of data collection will be created because there will be a market for them.
I think it's been interesting to watch the rise and fall of the Occupy Wall Street movement from the standpoint of a sort of a populist attack on capitalistic institutions. I agree with Ben. I think that there is fundamentally going to be a need in business for reliable statistics and data and a reliable picture of the world. The challenge is going to be: are they going to share it with us? Are they going to share it with us, or they're simply going to use it to make money for themselves, which is their obligation to their shareholders? The wonderful thing about government statistics is they're ours, whereas proprietary statistics are not. So yes, I think they will pursue the reality bubble, but I'm not sure they're going to let us in, and so I don't think we can rely on that to save us. I think you're right that that's what they're going to do, but I don't think it's our salvation.
I would say there's one other piece as well, which is, as a person in business, I want good information. But then, as a person in business, not me, of course, but I might not want to give full information. So I need information to take decisions, but I might obfuscate or manage or massage my image. I mean, again, it's one of the, and you can tell that this is the way, when you look at somebody like Rex Tillerson. So he was used to managing very strongly what got out from his company. And now he's had to transition into something where the expectation is there's a lot of transparency, and that is not working out. And so I think you have to remember that, again, journalists have to push doubly hard, because there's one other component, which is a lot of the things that we take for granted as public services, utilities, all kinds of things, are now privatized to companies. And these companies are not run by people who are elected by you and me. They're people who are appointed by the shareholders and so on. So all of a sudden you've gotten, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but because I find it fascinating, but so I could geek out all night. But part of the issue then is things that we're used to having transparency and understanding and going deep into, we can't see those things anymore unless the companies take responsibility for the fact that even though they're unelected, they still have an accountability. So textbooks get published by companies, yep. And so there's a responsibility on the board and the company to make sure that even if it's not something that makes a profit, it still gets published at a reasonable price, and the facts in it are facts, not alternative or wacky or any of those facts. And so that things get very complicated, that, you know, your kids go to school, they sit on chairs that hopefully won't break, but if somebody in the company thinks, you know, let's use a lesser material, the next thing you know, your kid's on the floor. You know, I mean, yeah. It's all of that. And that also goes to the media making business. So all of us write for some sort of media outlet, but if it's, you know, something that's not making as much money, you're going to see a lot less reporting in those areas, or those wonderful long-term projects that companies used to do more of, with long-form, in-depth, you know, years-long research. They just can't afford it anymore. And so, you know, all of that means that, you know, things that we took for granted as somebody was going to figure it out and tell us the truth, or something was going to happen and it was going to be okay, we can't take that for granted anymore.
I think another caution in this age, especially the age of Trump, is to be cautious about the applicability of business experience to government life. You know, that really the only thing being that being a CEO of a major company prepares you to do next is to be king. That's about what it prepares you to. It doesn't prepare you to lead a democratic society, because you don't have you never have to deal with any constituents. You never have to deal with any competing interests. So let's not fall into the meme of let's just run government like a business and it will all be better. I have one answer for that, and it's Enron, but business can really, really screw up too, and we need to hold them accountable for that.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things about Donald Trump, as with so many things, Italy did it first. You need a man of the people from outside politics to fix things, who likes women, who's a billionaire. Sounds familiar? He's been here. You've done it. Didn't work very well.
I just wanted to add. I mean, I totally agree on the with the rest of the panel. But I suppose the question is it good enough? And surely the answer of the financial crisis is no, it's not good enough. And that's why you have movements like Occupy and Blockupy and this great sort of sense of I've lost something here, and the people who really should have been blamed or paid haven't paid. So why is that fair? And it sort of also, if you take even a wider view and you look at the great victories of liberal economics have been probably I think undeniably an aggregate rise in well-being and welfare. But at an aggregate level, that doesn't help you if you're the dock worker in Rotterdam who used to be employed by the docks, and you were trained by the docks, and now you're a flexible worker and you have to sort of pay for your own training and deal with everything yourself. And so what is the answer for the dock worker? Well, probably it's something to do with skills and training, so it becomes a political question. But that's a bit probably the missing part for me.
So I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to go back to the question I posited right at the start, which was give me one actionable thing that we can do after this panel session to solve the issues posed in this debate. You can repeat what you said before. You can also say bring Robert De Niro to Perugia next year. We may have a bigger panel room then next time for that. So who wants to take that thorny issue first? Everyone's kind of looking at Ben.
Because we've been pondering this for over a decade, looking at it, and we come back to all of the debunking websites, the organizations that are trying to be neutral and call out politicians on all sides of the debate or businesses about what is, analyzing statements and whether or not they're true. I think that there is a surge of those organizations. There's all sorts of independent journalists to do that stuff too. The problem is still that you can explain away till you're blue in the face, and if people are not interested, they still won't pay any attention to that. But I certainly think that for the informed citizen, one of the things the web does give, as well as fake news, is more places to find things out than was ever feasibly possible, 15 years ago.
And I will beat my drum again. Financial literacy. Get it, spread it, use it. I think that's going to be the saving grace as we try to navigate economic news in the years to come.
I would just say, speaking from an institutional point of view, it's to make sure you're not retreating into the ivory tower. That's why we're trying to make sure we explain ourselves as clearly as possible. And I also you would never guess I'm in PR. We won a prize. The European Ombudsman gave us a prize for communication too. It's seamless. But I mean, and that's not about boasting. I say that's a nice indication that we're on the right track. I mean, I also think I said, we have got huge, endless amounts more to do. And it's a shared challenge. And also just going back to the Brexit question, that one of the issues there is that we collectively as Europeans haven't really talked to each other enough and explained what Europe is for and what the benefits of it are. That was particularly bad in the UK, but it's probably an issue elsewhere.
I guess I would say, first of all, speaking as both with my journalism hat and my business hat on, you've got to hold us to account. You have to hold business to account. It's your job. because that is part of creating an ecosystem that is dynamic and means that business will then have to hold itself to account, investors will have to hold themselves to account. My job as a board director has changed dramatically in the past 5 or 10 years because I'm no longer just accountable to representing shareholders' interests, but also the workers' interests, the environment, the community, all kinds of things. That job has changed, and your job has gotten a little harder, but then also a little easier because everybody demands transparency. The other thing I would do, in a little plug, is also about starting younger and teaching children about financial literacy and understanding their role in society and so on. So at 5:45 today, we're doing a panel on communicating news to children with a very dynamic and intelligent 10-year-old.
Who you know well?
I've seen him. And
Related possibly?
No, it's a completely different last name. He has my husband's last name. And so I think, but for all of us, if you're parents or teachers or newspaper editors or anything, you need to find ways of communicating to everybody and meeting people where they are. So you can't be snobby about how you write, because we can see what happens when people are left out and don't understand, be they young people, faraway people, nearby people. That's our job. I mean, let's not be cute. It's not our job just to talk to the people who are CEOs or have big yachts. Part of our job is to communicate effectively and make people interested in all walks of life.
And one of the other things I think we have to remember is that, journalists and institutions with an interest in objectivity, the recent, events of the last 12 months may have fired us up, but we have to be careful not to be seen kind of as partisan ourselves, of course, which is another issue, perhaps for another debate. So who would have thought economics would have kind of generated such an impassioned debate? I will finish up by thanking our panel and urging you to thank our panel for a brilliant debate. Perhaps we'll get Bob De Niro, is it Bob or Bobby, but back this year. But thank you very much. Please show your appreciation.
Digital revolution, where we have to learn a whole new vocabulary of technology and how technology is reshaping the economy. So add to that, just one last point, is a remarkable fragmentation of economic activity. I'm just finishing a book on the 1987 market crash. In the beginning of the 1980s, the New York Stock Exchange handled 90% of the daily stock trading activity in the United States. Today, it handles roughly 20%. And the rest of the stock trading activity occurs in any of 62 different platforms, some of them visible to regulators, some of them not. So the fragmentation of economic activity across the economy and the increasing complexity of it, I think, has been an enormous growth challenge to business journalists, and we've got a lot of learning yet to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
An abrupt stop. So let me introduce to my immediate right, Lucy Marcus, who is responsible for bringing this august panel together. And the first... I take the credit, not the blame. The first multi-tiered question that I have for Lucy is, have economists, financial institutions, and journalists, are we guilty as charged as being, talking down to the general public? If so, how can we fix that? And bearing in mind those first two questions, if we're kind of beating ourselves up too much, are we obscuring what perhaps we're doing well?
Technology, so confusing. I think there are a couple things to it. As you pointed out, we're living in a time when expertise is not so valued. And in some ways, it's our fault. We've lost the trust of people, like everybody else. I mean, trust is at such a low. We've used our own special language to almost keep ourselves apart and special. Either it's because we're ivory towered, or it makes us feel, sort of more powerful because, we call something different that actually has a normal name. We don't want to use that name. And so, or things have gone wrong even when an expert has said it would go this way. Experts have expertise, but they don't have, what are those things called? Yeah, well, clairvoyance, but what's the ball? The crystal ball. I lose small words. And so it's, by holding ourselves out as experts, and then when we disappoint, that is problematic. And in the meantime, and Ben will talk more about this, we say that something is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen, then the fault is ours, which is not completely wrong. I mean, I think there are also a lot of people who peddle themselves as experts who actually are just chancers. So there's that. And I think there are a couple things that are different in the time we're living in now that there were in the past as well. First of all, you didn't hear from the expert to the regular community of people. It often was filtered through a journalist. But now, I mean, I write a monthly column for something called Project Syndicate, and all it is people who are experts. So, so besides me, Nouriel Rubini and Joe Stiglitz and, a whole cast of people write monthly, and that's, instead of getting just a quote in a newspaper about something that somebody else decides is important, or getting a tome of an academic document that describes something, I will work almost harder in the 800 words to write something down, get it across in a concise manner, and using language people will understand, and then that's taken and translated into, I think, 13 languages and distributed around the world to newspapers in developing and also and developed but also underdeveloped countries, which I think is extremely important. So places where I wouldn't necessarily write specifically for the paper in Kinshasa will still get the document that I write, and that's a very important.
Am I audible now? Yes. I've had a long career in journalism, going on to 4 decades now, it can be admitted. And the changes in the world of business and finance coverage in the media has been extraordinary, really just extraordinary. In the very early days of my journalism career, you would be hard-pressed to find business and economics news prominently portrayed in even the largest American newspapers. John's former employer, the Wall Street Journal, was exceptional in focusing exclusively on that, and people assumed if anybody wanted any of that dull, dry, useless information, they'd subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and be done with it. But the economic disruptions of the 1970s changed that. The twin Arab boycotts that greatly reduced the supply of petroleum to the U.S., a long period of what was called stagflation, high rates of inflation, low rates of economic activity that kind of bollocks the traditional economic cure for either one of those, one being high rates, which would hurt the other, and the other being low rates, which would feed inflation. Alerted even New York City taxi drivers to the importance of economic news. And so economic news, as in the nuts and bolts of the economy, price levels, imports, that sort of thing, began to move onto the front pages and into more prominent roles. Financial news, not so. It still lagged behind until in the 80s we saw this outbreak of takeover activity, the financialization of virtually every known asset, the rise of Wall Street in the late 1980s, and the dominance of that financial sector. That again challenged the media to climb another new learning curve to figure out how finance worked. What exactly was a swap? What was an interest rate futures? To figure out these gimmicks of financial engineering that were so changing the flow of capital. So we climbed that learning curve, and then what do we meet? We meet the...
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion, which is entitled Reporting Economics Just Got Harder. My name is John Crowley, and I am the editor-in-chief of the International Business Times. Prior to that, I was the digital editor at the Wall Street Journal in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So economics is famously and somewhat erroneously referred to as the dismal science, but it's safe to say that false news is lending a whole new meaning to the phrase bad economics, with everyone from the Twitter troll to populist politicians misappropriating numbers and stats to their own ends. What can journalists, pollsters, and financial institutions do to ensure that the business of numbers is reported in a balanced and objective way? How do we skill up newsrooms, stay clear of jargon, and reach out to audiences without making them feel patronized or excluded? So last year, during the EU referendum, the then Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, said people had had enough of experts. Well, the depth of knowledge and expertise on this panel is likely to give Michael Gove the shakes. So the format of this discussion will go as this. Each panelist will introduce themselves, give a little bio, and then address one of my questions. We'll then open it up amongst ourselves, and then I will throw it open to the floor. And then right at the end, I think we've all agreed that each panelist will come up with one actionable solution. Let's see if they can do that. So without further ado, let me introduce to my immediate left is Diana Henriques, who is an award-winning journalist and writer. And perhaps, Diana, if you can tell us, your experience over the last few decades, seeing how the business of economics have changed, and bearing in mind the events of the last 12 months, how you see it developing in the future.
Yes. I'd be delighted to do that. Am I audible?
Way of democratizing information and ensuring that nobody is bereft of the knowledge that they need directly. So I think that's one thing that works really well. The other thing is we mustn't underestimate the power of the people. So we talk about how people are, the populism and how cross people are, but actually one of the things I've written a lot about is how people power is successful in my area. I work on business and ethics, corporate governance and boards, things like that. So much has changed so quickly, and a lot of it is thanks to social media and so on. So, the things that cause us problem also can be a part of the solution. I write about FIFA and, terrible corporate governance of that, or nonprofits and what's going on in that world. But always the theme is, business and ethics and governance and so on. And, which you can apply because everything, we were talking about this at breakfast this morning. If you're on Twitter, you saw the picture of us talking intently. And we were preparing hard for you. And there is no area now that isn't a business. Football, a business. Music and the arts, a business. Every organization, fashion, I've written a bunch about fashion, every organization, every sector, all of you at some point in your lives have or will sit on a board, will be responsible for the distribution of money, if it's a nonprofit board, a for-profit board, parent-teacher board, it's all the same stuff, and that comes with a lot of responsibility. And that also means that if you're doing something wrong, and we need more transparency, I talk a lot about transparency and building trust and so on, if something's going wrong, people will know and they will see and they will ask you to be accountable. So as journalists who cover this, I write opinion, which is a lovely luxury, but one of the things that we've talked about is we need journalists who are covering this area to really understand it and take the time to go deep on understanding how businesses work and how to push people and ask hard questions, which you really need to do, and how to get different voices and so on. So I think that answers all the questions.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, now we move on to Ben Page,